Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into the second half of Matt Walsh's Real History of the Civil War. Found myself disagreeing with him a lot less than I thought I would in the first video, though, as I highlighted several times in that video, it's really more about my disagreement on him giving only a particular part of the picture rather than the whole. For example, one of the things I was thinking about a lot after I finished recording that video is how he spent so much time focused on the Battle of Chancellorsville to highlight Robert E. Lee in terms of his brilliance as a commander, but didn't give just as much time to talking about Ulysses S. Grant's brilliant Vicksburg campaign, which wasn't just a single battle, was a series of battles and was a strategic victory that really was a turning point in the war that had a long-term impact on the outcome. If Walsh's point is to educate people on things they don't normally hear about, fine. But if you're saying this is the real history of the Civil War, I think it's important to point that out, that the North had some brilliant generals as well, in terms of generals like Grant and especially the Vicksburg campaign. So with all of that in mind, we're going to dive into part 2 today. I should also mention that when I uploaded part 1, I just finished recording part 1 about an hour ago. I edited it, uploaded it, immediately got a takedown notice from the media company that manages Matt Walsh's videos. So that's currently being appealed. So hopefully that doesn't affect too much the release of these videos. I always win those appeals anytime I've had anything like that happen. But so it goes. Let's dive in.
One of the great myths of the Civil War is that the South was somehow uniquely evil.
Wouldn't say uniquely.
Indeed, at the time, abolitionists aggressively pushed propaganda with exactly that message. As Thomas Fleming writes in A Disease in the Public Mind, a new understanding of why we fought the Civil War, quote, "The abolitionists convinced themselves, based on their evangelical experiences, that smearing the South's reputation in every possible way would create the anxiety that would lead to a mass conversion of the North to their crusade. The South was portrayed as a province ruled by Satan that would consume the North's soul if her citizens did not vow to expunge the sin of slavery."
This was a view that was not just held by abolitionists. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, I would not describe before the war as an abolitionist, but in his second inaugural address, he dealt with this topic, this view that basically said that the bloodshed in the Civil War was what God required of the United States to compensate for the hundreds of years of enslavement of millions of African Americans. A lot of people viewed it that way. And painting your political opposition as evil and as on the wrong side of history or as on the wrong side of God is not unique to this situation. This is a pretty common tactic.
Meanwhile, in the South, there was an intense fear of slave insurrections and race wars following the brutal uprising and revolution in present-day Haiti.
Yep.
Therefore, the Civil War, Fleming argues, is best understood as a product of a psychological disease that afflicted both the North and the South in different ways, which made rational dialogue impossible. Sound familiar? That mutual disease, he argues, is why only the U.S., unlike Great Britain and Brazil, fought a brutal war over slavery. And yet, long after the war, some of these over-the-top descriptions of the South as simply evil survive today.
We fought a brutal civil war because we had a third of our country that would rather fight a civil war than live without slavery. I mean, it was unique in the United States in that it was so ingrained in the culture and the economic system of one particular part of the country. So you had the geographic difference, right? So in the UK, number one, it wasn't a huge deal for them to abolish slavery when they did in the 1830s because, well, in the UK there wasn't slavery. I mean, slavery, though it existed in the empire, had been outlawed by and large in the UK for hundreds of years. And even if it did exist, it didn't exist to the tune of 4 million people who were enslaved like it did in the American South. So there's really no comparison to be made between how the UK abolished slavery in the 1830s and the U.S. having to fight a war.
The cartoon version of history holds that Abraham Lincoln invaded the South because it had slaves. But just how peculiar was this?
I don't think anybody thinks that. Anybody who has studied the Civil War for 5 minutes knows that that's not what happened.
South's peculiar institution, as it was called. Well, not very, as it turns out. The North had slaves too.
Yeah.
According to the book, It Wasn't About Slavery by Samuel Mitchum Jr., in 1703, more than 42% of New York City households owned slaves.
1703, not 1860. 1703.
A ratio only surpassed by Charleston, South Carolina. In Connecticut, Mitchum says 1/2 of all ministers, lawyers, and public officials owned slaves. By 1783, 1/4 of Connecticut families owned slaves, and 1 out of every 14 people in Rhode Island was a slave. Many prominent Northerners, including founding fathers, owned slaves.
Yeah.
This includes the first signer of the Declaration of Independence and future Massachusetts Governor John Hancock, who had 2 or 3 household slaves. Other notable slaveholders from Massachusetts include...
There's a world of difference between what was happening in the 1770s and how the institution had changed and ingrained itself in the South by the 1860s. Because in part of the invention of the cotton gin, which made holding large numbers of enslaved people on plantations profitable.
Cotton Mather, who learned about inoculation from one of his slaves. Slavery in the North was awful. Massachusetts and Connecticut set curfews for black people. According to the book Black Bondage in the North, in the 1700s, Connecticut required blacks to be off the streets by 9 at night and to remain within the towns to which they belonged. Slaves who broke curfew in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island were flogged. In New Hampshire, the penalty was 10 lashes. In New York, it was a misdemeanor for slaves to gather in groups larger than 4. And in Long Island, they could not travel more than a mile from home without a pass. Similar laws existed in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected, slavery had been banned in most, but not all, Union states.
Right.
It's important to point...
Well, first of all, these are all Union states when Abraham Lincoln is elected. Alabama was a Union state. Georgia was a Union state. They were all Union states, okay? Yeah. So when Abraham Lincoln is elected, yes, there are some states where slavery existed that did not secede. That would be the proper way to present this.
Point out that while radical abolitionists in the 1850s were calling for the South to immediately free all of their slaves, the northern states didn't end slavery that way. For the most part, the manumission of slaves in the North was a gradual process. The laws emancipated people born in the future and were designed so northern slaveholders didn't lose money.
Right, but if there had been an opportunity to do that, it would have happened. But the South was never letting go of the people they had enslaved. They weren't going to gradually do that on their own, at least not at that time. Maybe eventually. You can't compare the North and the South here because it's a completely different level of enslavement that was happening pre-Civil War.
Cases, northern slaveholders just sold their slaves to the South. One overlooked fact is that early attempts to curb the slave trade had Southern support. In his 1806 State of the Union, President Thomas Jefferson...
The slave trade. That's the trade where you're going over and you're kidnapping more Africans in Africa to bring to the United States. The Constitution actually provisioned that. It said that starting 20 years from the adoption of the Constitution, the slave trade could be outlawed, and that happened under Jefferson's administration. But here's the thing. If you're a person who owns a large number of enslaved people like Thomas Jefferson did, what happens the minute you can't import anybody new? The existing ones become much, much more valuable. If you found out tomorrow that no new houses could be built in the United States, the value of existing homes would skyrocket because you can't make new ones.
Virginian and a slave owner called on Congress to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. The next year, the United States Congress voted to abolish the slave trade. The bill passed the House with 96% of representatives yes, including massive support from Southern members of Congress.
The slave trade. But again, there's a secret caveat to that, which is the value of existing ones.
There are two reasons why Southern members of Congress voted this way. First, at the time, many people in the South wanted to end slavery. By 1827, more than 100 anti-slavery groups existed in the South, mostly under the banner of colonization societies, which advocated for sending freed slaves back to Africa.
And this was a common feeling among people in the North. Abraham Lincoln supported colonization.
Second, and more importantly, profits from the slave trade weren't going to the South. The slave trade was a northern business, and Jefferson's bill was ineffective at stopping it. According to the book Black Cargoes by Daniel Mannix, an English captain reported that the port of Lamu in the slave market of Zanzibar was packed with, quote, enterprising Americans whose star-spangled banner may be seen streaming in the wind where other nations would not deign to traffic.
Hold on a second.
Wait.
All right, I just want to give a little more context to this, and I feel like I wish I had done more of that in the first video, where I acknowledged that he was giving facts, but that he was only giving the facts that painted the South in a better light to the detriment of the North, to somehow give balance. So I want to balance that back a little bit. In the years leading up, the couple of decades leading up to the banning of the importation of slaves, in just the 4 years, 1804 to 1807, 80,000 enslaved Africans were brought into Charleston Harbor alone. Savannah, Georgia was the other major port that they were brought into, and then some into Gulf Coast ports like New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. Now, what he did say that is absolutely accurate, it was mostly New England shipping companies that were responsible for the transportation of these enslaved Africans. Somewhere between 60 and 90% of the slave trading fleet came out of Rhode Island alone. So these are merchant dynasties that are making money on that triangle trade that many of us learned about in school. And then they're selling them in the ports in Charleston and in Savannah primarily. But that said, a lot of the people who were enslaved, who were imported into the Deep South, came from other parts of the United States, like the Upper South, places like Virginia, because these companies knew they could make a lot more money selling these enslaved people to large plantations in the Deep South. And so there's a lot of that going on. So it's northern shippers and southern plantations that are getting wealthy off the backs of these kidnapped Africans.
1858, as Abraham Lincoln was running for Senate in Illinois, there were 24 American ships in the Zanzibar harbor as against 3 British. There are 2 reasons the British Navy, which at the time was trying to end the slave trade, couldn't stop American slavers. First, American ships were extremely fast and maneuverable. And second, President John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts forbade the British from boarding any American flagged ships. The result was huge profits for Massachusetts-based slave traders. Mannix writes that, quote, so many of the ships hailed from Salem, Massachusetts, that the Zanzibarians thought all white men came from this one New England town. English officers discovered to their indignation that Great Britain was considered to be a suburb of Salem. The Americans traded for slaves and ivory with a cheap calico turned out in vast quantities by the New England cotton mills, and even today cotton is called Americani in Zanzibar. Moving slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and Brazil was big money for Northerners. This part of the slave trade was its own version of the famous triangle trade. Cheap Southern cotton was shipped north to textile mills, which Northerners turned into manufactured textile goods. Northern slave traders traded those textiles for slaves in Zanzibar, who were then trafficked to the Caribbean for huge profits. The North was profiting from slavery on all 3 corners of the triangle. This continued for decades.
No one questions the fact that the North also profited from slavery, but the North is also who ended slavery. Let's not forget that.
W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that by the 1850s, quote, the fitting out of slavers became a flourishing business in the United States and centered at New York City. In 1862, literally during the Civil War, the New York Journal of Commerce reported that New York was, quote, the principal port of the world for this infamous commerce, although the cities of Portland, Maine, and Boston are second to her in that distinction. As New England was making money off the global slave trade, other northern states were passing racist legislation. In Lincoln's home state of Illinois, black people couldn't attend public schools,
That's true.
couldn't testify against white people in court, or bear arms. If 3 or more of them gathered to dance, they were fined and lashed.
And Illinois was interesting, like a lot of states. Ohio was this way as well, and I'm sure others were, where the southern part of Illinois was very different than the northern part. Southern Illinois, if you look at it, I mean, it's further south than Kentucky. It's down bordering Tennessee and Arkansas, or Tennessee and Missouri. It's very much the South. Southern Ohio was similar that way, being right across the river from Kentucky, which was a slave state, right across the river from Virginia, which was a slave state.
The purpose of these laws, which were known as the Illinois Black Codes, was to discourage black people from moving to the state. In 1853, Illinois made things more explicit with a black exclusion law that, quote, prohibited blacks from coming into the state with the intention of living there. Punishment proved especially harsh in that violators were subject to penalties that amounted to forced labor, essentially slavery. Illinois law...
Most Northerners were racist. They were white supremacists. But in the end, it was the Northerners who fought to preserve the Union and then eventually turned it into a war to end slavery. And in the aftermath of the American Civil War, it was the Northerners who were doing all they could to fight for civil rights for the South.
It was so extreme that it was a crime for blacks to settle in that state without a certificate of freedom, which cost $1,000, the equivalent of about $40,000 today. The black codes were so harsh that even some southern newspapers objected. The New Orleans Bee called the Illinois Black Codes an act of special and savage ruthlessness.
Right. I mean, ponder the hypocrisy of this statement. It's a special and savage ruthlessness to deny rights to freed black human beings. But not quite so bad if we just own those people, right? I mean, just shut up. I don't want to hear from a southern newspaper in one of the cities where slavery was the most prevalent about how these laws were horrendous. Don't get me wrong. But shut up, New Orleans. I don't want to hear that from you.
One of the key figures in passing the Black Codes was a state representative named John Logan.
Yep.
Logan was an enthusiastic enforcer of the Fugitive Slave Act and an open racist. Abraham Lincoln later made him a Union general. After the war, Logan reinvented himself as a radical Republican senator, but it's hard to imagine that Johnny Logan held contemporary woke views on black people.
He did, though. And John Logan's also the man most responsible for us having Memorial Day as a holiday. Let's dive into this one a little more. So John Logan, after the American Civil War, in which he was one of the best, what we call political generals in the Civil War, spent 2 decades in the House and then in the Senate. He was actually James Blaine's running mate for the presidency. Logan was the vice presidential nominee in 1884 on that losing ticket against Grover Cleveland. But John Logan voted for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and worked as hard as anyone to abolish slavery, to secure birthright citizenship, and to guarantee voting rights for African American men. He served as one of the 7 House managers who prosecuted the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson and fiercely targeted Johnson for his vetoes of the Reconstruction legislation. In 1867, Logan traveled the country speaking in favor of universal male suffrage. During a speech supporting black voting rights here in Ohio, he publicly shed his former white supremacist rhetoric, saying, "I don't care whether a man is black, red, blue, or white. If he is a civilized man in a Christian community like ours, he has the right to say who the men shall be that control the government." And as commander-in-chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, he worked really hard to foster an integrated membership where the black and white veterans marched and served together. Yes, he was absolutely a racist who fought in favor of those black codes as a Democrat in the 1850s. As a radical Republican in the 1860s and 70s, completely changed his tune. He was one of the champions of civil rights. And I would like to just add that I would think that Matt Walsh, who is someone who says he's a Christian, could understand as well as anyone what the power of a transformed life is all about.
Many northern or free states enacted black laws or exclusionary codes similar to Illinois. Indiana and Oregon banned black settlement in their state constitutions. According to Eugene Berwanger's book, The Frontier Against Slavery, quote, "The exact extent of racial prejudice as a factor encouraging limitation of slavery is indeterminable. The average man in all ages does not record his thoughts for posterity and is even less likely to do so on such thorny problems as race relations. Yet, if
So we shouldn't blame the South for being racist because they didn't come out and say, hey, I'm racist.
0.5% of the people in Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, and Kansas voted to exclude the free Negroes simply because of their prejudice, surely this antipathy influenced their decision to support the non-extension of slavery. As Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, put it, quote, "The motive of those who protested against the extension of slavery had always been concern for the welfare of the white man, and not an unnatural sympathy for the Negro." In other words, many Northern and Western voters opposed the expansion of slavery into their states and territories, not primarily out of moral opposition to slavery itself, but because they didn't want black neighbors.
It wasn't even so much about black neighbors, because the expansion of slavery had nothing to, it was more about slavery can undercut anybody in terms of, free labor is free labor. And it's the same kinds of reasons why people often have an issue with illegal immigration today. They see people coming in, taking it, getting benefits. They think that, are taking away money out of the pockets of the government, but also they're undercutting American workers, right? I mean, that's how people view that, and a lot of people view that the same way. But here's the bottom line in all of this. Yes, people evolved on their views on this. For me, the real question here is, in the years leading up to the Civil War, we can talk about 1770. We can talk about those times. In the years leading up to, and especially after the Civil War, in the antebellum, or in the postbellum period, what were people's views then? The South continued, by and large, to treat these freedmen as slaves, and they passed a lot of laws that made them second-class citizens, and in many cases contracted them in ways that made them just like slaves. In the North, people were much more accepting. Not everywhere, and a lot of people weren't. Everything he's saying is true, but it's a part of the picture.
In the first half of the 1800s, many Southerners supported emancipation and the relocation of slaves. In many cases, because they thought the black populations of their states were getting too big. After Nat Turner's violent slave revolt in Virginia in 1831, thousands of Virginians petitioned their government to end slavery. Charles County Quakers issued a petition calling for a new law declaring that all persons born in the state after some period to be fixed by law shall be free.
Yeah, there were absolutely anti-slavery people in the South, just as there were pro-slavery people in the North. It's just that most pro-slavery people were in the South. Most slave owners were in the South.
Virginia's governor at the time wrote in his diary that, "Before I leave this government, I will have contrived to have a law passed gradually abolishing slavery in this state." The Richmond Inquirer at the time called...
A lot of this video is centered on people's intentions and not their actions, right? We can talk all day about the Confederate generals who said that they abhorred slavery, but they still fought to defend it, and they still participated in it. You can have a governor say, "I hope by the time I leave office that I can pass a law that helps with the gradual abolition of slavery in my state," but he didn't. So, good intentions, words, they don't mean a lot without the actions.
Slavery, the greatest evil which can scourge our land. The Virginia House of Delegates failed to end slavery then, but it wasn't by an overwhelming vote. Many people didn't realize that the window to end slavery through the legal process likely peaked right at the beginning of the country and into the early 1800s. In 1794, the incentives radically changed after Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin.
Right.
That invention, more than anything else, dramatically increased the demand for slave labor in the South because it made cotton cultivation vastly more profitable.
Yeah, because the time it took to cultivate cotton by hand meant that it just wasn't profitable because the cost of feeding and housing human beings to use as free labor didn't justify the amount of output they were able to have. But the cotton gin changed that.
As the Civil War approached, the hundreds of anti-slavery groups that had formed in the mid-1820s had mostly gone away, and so had any possibility that Southern legislatures would end slavery on their own. The debate after Nat Turner's rebellion was the last major attempt to do so. And so slavery persisted for decades. though many Virginians knew it was wrong. One of them was Robert E. Lee himself. According to
Here's the thing about Virginia. Virginia is not one of the cotton states, right? It's more northern. It's got a significant number of enslaved people, but Virginia isn't like almost solely dependent on it the way that a state like Mississippi is, where you have basically half the population are enslaved.
And Alan Guelzo, Lee, quote, regarded slavery as a moral and political evil, which, however, he was content to leave in the hands of God to resolve.
So it's awful, but I'm not going to do anything about it. You know, I'm content to just let God take care of it, right? That only works so far, especially when you're a slave owner.
Lee's slaves were inherited, one slave family from his mother and 197 others from his father-in-law, G.W.P. Custis. In 1862, during the war, Lee, quote, completed the emancipation of the Custis slaves, which he was obligated to do by his father-in-law's will, and then freed his own, which he was not.
Yeah, so George Washington Parke Custis, the Custis Lee Mansion that you're seeing there in the background, which is the prominent building on the Arlington National Cemetery grounds. George Washington Parke Custis is buried on the grounds of Arlington. That was his property. He was the grandson of Martha Washington, the biological grandson of Martha Washington. It was Martha Washington's son. He was known as Jack Custis, or Jackie. So he was George Washington's stepson, and Jack died while they were in Yorktown during the Yorktown campaign as a teenager, or like early 20s, I guess he was. But he leaves behind this son, George Washington Parke Custis, who George Washington, first president, adopts him. And so he kind of, even though he's his step-grandson, he's his adopted son. And so then George Washington Parke Custis, his daughter, is Mrs. Robert E. Lee. And so he dies in 1857. He does stipulate in his will that these nearly 200 enslaved people are to be freed within 5 years. Robert E. Lee stretches that all the way out to the absolute limit. But in the meantime, he is sending these enslaved people out to work other places. He's breaking up families, which was something George Washington Parke Custis tried not to do as much as possible. Again, listen, when you're talking about benevolent slave owners, right? Like people who, well, he didn't break up families. Yeah, he still owned those families though. So context, right? But from all the accounts I've read, those enslaved people, when they were inherited by Robert E. Lee from his father-in-law, the enslaved people felt they were treated far worse by Robert E. Lee than they had been by George Washington Parke Custis. And there are 1859, this is 2 years before the start of the Civil War, 1859 accounts from people who had run away from Robert E. Lee's ownership, who testified to his bad treatment of enslaved people. So yeah, he might have said he believes slavery to be a moral and political evil, but according to his own enslaved people, he was not particularly kind to them and was willing to beat them and willing to punish them severely and willing to break up families in order to maximize the profits on those enslaved people. But yes, it is true he never purchased his own slaves, but he inherited them all, right? And he did free most of those ones that were inherited from George Washington Parke Custis. All right, so a little shorter than our first episode, but I'm going to wrap it up right there because we're starting the home stretch and we're getting into another chapter. There's about 20 minutes left of the video itself, but I did a lot of digging into some stuff, a lot of extra talking this time around, so we only covered a small part of Matt Walsh's video, but we're going to get through the rest in part 3 of this reaction. Hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank Eric Hartung and Daniel Martins for your support on Patreon. Be watching for part 3. Thanks.